Good morning. Hello to everybody. Bonjour. Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning.
In Spanish, if you allow me. Bien, si les parece.
Okay, let's begin. I'm going to start. This is a great day for this committee because here I am chairing the Fisheries Committee, back again. And because of unforeseen circumstances, the chair is not able to be here today. And I'm the coordinator of the majority group, so it's up to me to chair today. And I'm delighted to do so. Even though it's been a bit of a last-minute attack, if you like. I've just suddenly been summoned to do this. Anyway, let's look at what we're doing today. We're going to have quite a full day and very interesting day. First of all, we're going to look at item 11, cost and benefits of spatial protection measures as tools for fisheries management. And under this item, I am delighted to present this study to you on the cost and benefits of spatial protection measures. And this has been on the table for quite a long time now. I think this is a very crucial issue. So it's dealing with marine protected areas and spatial protection measures in relation to development of fisheries. The Policy Department was requested to carry out a study, and this was entrusted to MRAG Europe, a company with relevant expertise. And here today we've got with us Dr. Stephen Mangi, Dr. Robert Wakeford, and Stephen Hodgson. I hope I've pronounced their names correctly. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. And I think we'll start with the order that I suggested at the start there. And we'll have around 20 or 25 minutes to make sure that we have time afterwards for a round of statements by the members. And we can also ask for clarification on any particular points you might want to. So, Dr. Mangi? Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here today to present our study on costs and benefits of special protection measures as tools for fisheries management. So I just run through the structure of the presentation. We will give our background of the study, move through objective, and explain three main measures that we've been researching on. Move through a legal framework for special protection measures in Europe, and then focus mainly on the case study assessments that we've been doing. And then from there, we will drill out key conclusions and recommendations. So just to set the scene, really, this is all to set the scene, we've been looking at the need for based on the EU biodiversity strategy for 30% of the sea area to be strictly protected, and this is mainly to set up a well-connected MPS. Part of that is also meeting objectives set by in the Common Fisheries Policy, the Marine Fisheries Framework Directive, and also the Birds and Habitat Directive. And with that, then, what we structured this study to do was look at the costs and benefits of marine protected areas. It's an economic activity when you set up these protected areas, and therefore, one of the kind of well-known frameworks is this cost-benefit framework. And therefore, we were interested in looking at three main special protection measures: fish stock recovery areas, marine protected areas, and other areas designated as effective area-based conservation measures. In the next 2 slides, I'll explain a bit more about these. But what we wanted to look at is also how co-management is being applied and how that then could help meet some of the EU targets. And like I said, we'll aim is really put together some conclusion and recommendations going forward. So if you think of fish stock recovery areas, this is a new term, but essentially it refers to the highly protected areas, which in some cases they've been called no-take zones or fishery reserves, fully protected areas. And these are areas that are protected from all forms of fishing. Marine protected areas is the catch-all term that's being used. And this is generally, it's low levels of protection, but in most cases you find that they have a core zone, which is an integral reserve where different forms of fishing are also not allowed. So the majority of the MPS we'll be referring to here are multiple use zones where you've got areas that are used for fishing, but then you've got other areas that are strictly protected in the core areas. When it comes to the other areas of effective best measures, here what we're looking at, biodiversity protection is a secondary objective. The areas are managed, okay, and incidentally, they tend to protect biodiversity. We can look at things like offshore wind farms, because then if there are restrictions to fishing in those areas or other use activities, means that the biodiversity inside those areas stay protected. You can look at that from powering areas for military and even power plants. So because then there is that limited entry, it means that some species and ecosystem in those areas are also protected. I'll pass in to my colleague to talk about the legal framework.
Thank you very much. The legal framework for spatial protection measures derives from a mixture of international law in accordance with the law of the Sea Convention, to which all member states are party, EU law in the form of regulation and directives, and the national laws of member states. What do I do? Yeah. In accordance with international law, the territorial sea of a coastal state can extend up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline, usually the low water mark. And within the territorial sea, the coastal state has sovereignty subject only to the right of innocent passage of foreign vessels. Sovereignty implies the right to adopt laws and regulations regarding conservation of fisheries and other marine resources, including the designation of spatial protection measures. Beyond the territorial sea, a coastal state can claim an exclusive economic zone that can extend up to 200 nautical miles from the baseline. All of the member states have claimed exclusive economic zones in the Atlantic, North Sea and Baltic, and some member states in the Mediterranean Sea have claimed EEZs or are in the process of doing so, but there are some complications in the Mediterranean. Within the exclusive economic zone, a coastal state has sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring, exploiting, conserving and managing the natural resources there, including the living marine resources, and of course can adopt legislation and designate spatial protection measures. Beyond, I think we've gone one too far. Beyond the outer limit of the EEZ or the territorial sea, if there isn't an EEZ, the regime of the high seas applies, where all states enjoy the freedom of fishing, subject to certain limited obligations, including the duty to cooperate for the conservation and management of living marine resources on the high seas. Next, please. In terms of international law, a range of RFMOs, Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, or agreements have been set up within which conservation measures, including spatial protection measures, can be designated. And a range of different RFMOs, RFMAs are shown on the screen. Some of them are species-based, in the top picture. The others are area-based. However, the key point to note is that such measures are only binding as regards the states that are party to the organization or agreement. Next slide, please. Oops. Similar rules apply with regard to high seas marine protected areas, whereby states can agree amongst themselves a recognition of MPAs on the high seas, or they can adopt measures in the form of recommendations rather than obligations in the expectation that these will eventually come to be seen as best practice and a form of customary international law. And to date, a number of high seas MPAs have been established in high sea areas adjacent to Europe, including in the North Atlantic Ocean, particularly the case of the OSPAR Commission, where several MPAs have been designated, and in the Mediterranean through the Barcelona Convention, through the establishment of specially protected areas of Mediterranean interest, the SPAMIs, in accordance with the 1995 protocol. So we do find high seas marine protected areas in the Mediterranean as well. In terms of EU law, the legal basis for spatial protection measures depends evidently on the subject matter. In terms of fisheries, the basic regulation provides for multi-annual plans which can be of spatial scope and FSRAs as well. The Mediterranean also contains particular measures on spatial protection measures in terms of union and national fishing protected areas. As regards the environmental acquis, the Birds Directive provides for the establishment of special protected areas, the Habitats Directive for special areas of conservation, and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive includes MPAs as one of the measures that member states should use in order to obtain a good status for coastal waters. And then finally, of course, the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive especially is concerned with spatial management in terms of national maritime spatial plans. So that's another type of spatial protection measure. Moving on to the question of co-management, in terms of fisheries and aquaculture spatial protection measures, the starting point to note is that there's no established legal definition of co-management. Co-management is a range of activities from consultation to decision-making and enforcement. In terms of fisheries, the key point to note is that in accordance with the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the EU has exclusive competence with regard to fisheries matters, the conservation of marine biological resources under the CFP. Part 11 provides for the establishment of the 11 mostly regional advisory councils to promote a balanced representation of stakeholders. But in terms of EU law as such, there is limited scope for member states to adopt their own fisheries conservation measures based on spatial protection measures because of their limited ability to actually legislate on fisheries management. The rights of member states to legislate for fisheries management are typically confined to the territorial sea in the nearshore area, subject to a number of rather limited cases. Next slide, please. In contrast, as regards other spatial protection measures, as regards both the aquaculture sector and environmental policy, this is an area where the EU shares competence with the member states. So while neither the Birds Directive or the Habitats Directive actually specifically address the issue of co-management, this is because it's up to the member states themselves to determine how the conservation objectives are to be achieved, and therefore the extent to which they should embrace co-management of such protected areas in terms of their own national legislation. While the MSP Directive particularly specifically provides for the involvement of stakeholders in the development of maritime spatial plans, this could be seen as a form of co-management. Back to you, Mangi.
Okay. So the first thing we did in this study was to look at the current state of art when it comes to cost-benefit, the use of cost-benefit framework in assessing marine protected areas. And a lot of what we found here was that although the costs and benefits can be systematically described, when it comes to quantification, there is we're still behind in the sense that finding costs and benefits and working out the actual net benefits of that protection is still a challenge. Therefore, fully costed studies are very few. But wherever those studies are done, you tend to find that there is more benefits, overall benefits than costs. Okay, so a key part of our study was to move to look at specific case studies, as I said, and this is kind of where the really bulk of the study was based on. So we have 3 case studies that I'll be going through today, and the first one is this fishing box in France. It's the Ile de Seine fish enclosure, which, you know, in our study we put that as a fish stock recovery area, although it's not been established under that term. But it's situated in the west coast of Brittany, and it covers around 49 kilometers squared. It's been, it was established in 2007, but effective enforcement started in 2009. So a lot of what we're reporting is really from 2010 coming to now. Different organizations were involved, and this was really key, as we'll see later, with co-management, because having that bottom-up setup meant that you know, it was easier then to, you know, run the fish stock recovery area. And among the costs, if we look at it that way, is first in this the Ile de Seine fishing box, there's no cost recovery method. So, you know, although some of the fishermen that are allowed to fish there are using these small-scale hooks, they don't have to pay a license fee. Okay, a lot of the implementation costs, which mainly involves staff time, that's covered by partial funding from the government. Some of it, like research, it comes from IFRAMER. And the national park, because the fishing box is inside the Arnes Marine Park, the enforcement is covered by enforcement costs are covered by the park. So we you know, through our stakeholder consultation, we found that on average in a year, it's around 30,000 euros that are used to run the park. So these are all the implementation costs, and half of that is really, it comes from the you know, contribution from the marine park. In terms of benefits, in this kind of the period we were looking at here, the population of spine lobster showed quite a lot of improvement. And this, like I said, started with when the enforcement was you know, a bit more rigorous. And the catch especially has stabilized across the whole fishery. And surveys done by FRME have shown that there's a return of juveniles even further away, because one of the management measures that is adopted here is for buried females not to be caught. And therefore, because they are left there, more and more production is going on. But also there's some sort of soft benefits. You want to look at it that way. That regular monitoring by IFRAMER is improving that understanding on the biology and population of these crustaceans. When it comes to co-management, as I've already alluded to, because it was set up on a bottom-up approach by the fishermen going ahead and saying this is an area that we like to protect, it's just been a catalyst for, you know, the different groups to come together, from the fishing to management and through research. And therefore, that initiation process is being used as, you know, best practice. And when we were when we were out and about in this case study, stakeholders informed us that the level of compliance, you know, is quite high, because, you know, the fishermen themselves drove to have this area, this fishing box established. And this is one of the other ways to look at when you talk about marine protected area. People feel like it's something that is being imposed on them, and therefore they sort of, you know, don't warm up to this. But in this case, because it was driven by the fishermen, they don't see it as an MPA. If anything, they just see it as we have different measures around here which we can live with, but also are helping our fishery. And that's a really good thing to know. Okay, going back to the second case study now, and this one is the marine protected area of fishing interests. It's in the north of Galicia in Spain, and it's quite large. You got like 2,163 hectares, but out of those you've got this no-take zone, which is 145 hectares. Okay, and the fishermen here again, they actively participated in the designation process, and the key thing here was coming up with a vision which could give the biodiversity protection, but also maintaining the livelihoods of fishers. So the back and forth discussions here ended up having, you know, this area also established around that 2007. And the costs a lot of them are covered by the government, so it's you know, they did not receive, they don't have an active source of income to, you know, run the MPA apart from public funds. There's been a big investment in terms of our vessel monitoring system to track the vessels that are allowed to use in the park, and that money also came from the public funds. So, you know, if from the Junta de Galicia puts in, or rather funds staff to cover the MPA and the different offices that work on that, without really having a separate kind of pot of funding that comes specific to that MPA. And all the administrative costs and others are also covered in that. And therefore, it's difficult then for us to separate, or rather come up with an individual figure of the cost for the MPA. But that 500,000 euros is a good estimate for an annual, you know, the expense that went into that MPA. And if you look at the benefits, then annual income and profit has gone up, and this we're looking at a 10-year period here, and that is reflected in the fish sales at the nearby market in Lira. There's also been an improvement in local fisheries, in economic performance, and, you know, kind of a bit of a really good case is that you've got young people now joining the fishery because they feel, you know, their sort of livelihoods are going to be supported because you've got an MPA which has the fishery interest set up in mind. Okay, so the improvement in fish stocks that are being exploited there also come at a stage where there have been other landing restrictions that have been imposed to kind of manage the area. And this is also based on our stakeholder consultation. We found that even recreational opportunities around the area were on the rise. Okay, so when it comes to co-management, very similar to the case study 1 in France, fishermen here were involved right at the start, and therefore the co-management model that's, you know, been used here is now being rolled on to other areas. And a lot of it was the fishers were consulted so that they, you know, their ecological knowledge could be used to, you know, set up the MPA, and with that then means, you know, looking for alternatives, you know, viable alternatives, sustain the community, how that knowledge could be used to inform management decision, and that then have ended up strengthening the co-management system. And that is essentially the basis of the success of the MPA, working together, looking for solutions, but also using the knowledge that, you know, fishers have. Okay, I'll move to the third case study, and we're looking at cage farms in Greece here, which then to us, these are an example of the other areas of conservation interest that we mentioned. And this concept is relatively new. It's sort of yet to, you know, sort of be formalized when it comes to the case study. But we just thought that you know, it's got a good way to explain how the cage farm meet this new concept, and it's because once the leased area, there's a 50-meter zone after that leased area, which is completely no-tech, and then you've got a 200-meter around that, which is a no-trawling zone. And these then almost kind of, you know, the same zonation that we find in many MPAs, and therefore they kind of meet that criteria. Then the next thing is to see whether there is a legal framework, whether the licensing system is strict enough, and how, you know, the different stakeholders when it comes to marine spatial planning for the different sectors. And the assessment we did here, you know, kind of brought quite a lot of those factors, and in fact the cage farms can tick that box as OECMs. So although these are not, like I said, they are not up and running, we try to estimate the costs and benefits, and especially looked at the idea of co-management, how it would apply to these OECMs, And one of the rather couple of points to bring to your attention here are these cage farms. Their role towards fisheries and aquaculture could even be enhanced by putting devices, ecotools. So these are like artificial reefs. And once those are there, those would be attractive to fish. And given that you already have got this no trawling zone and the kind of area around it, means these can build in population and end up with having the spillover effect that most MPAs are, kind of we're working, rather they are set up to achieve in some cases. But also once you have that, you can also involve some ecotourism activities by having visitors attend those areas. They could even snorkel around those areas. And with that, then it means aquaculture is not just seen as this, kind of activity that has all those environmental impacts, but actually, a better understanding towards tourism and leisure facilities. And that then is a catalyst which could bring the aquaculture sector with the fisheries sector, because there's benefits that both are achieving in that same areas. And clearly because that area won't be fished, it will be protecting biodiversity. So when it comes to co-management, there's currently not such arrangements, I guess, because we're still talking of them being kind of established as OECMs, but now they just exist as cage farms. See. But these positive interactions, especially when you start bringing these artificial reef effects within the cage farms, then means that there's a way here where these conflicts between, sort of the fishing sector and the aquaculture sector can be solved, and that could be one of the kind of key drivers towards co-management. Okay, so key things. I think the case study we used here have been set up kind of bottom-up, driven by the fishing industry, and therefore it's very clear to see how they, kind of co-management is quite strong in these case studies. I know some cases will be a bit different, but I think from our case, we couldn't get the kind of quantitative costs in most of these areas because some of those are covered by public funds, are covered by government, and in the majority of cases anyway, the special protection measures we were looking at here do not have specific income-generating activities themselves. However, they were associated with quite a few benefits. Key ones of these are stabilizing catches, increasing annual profit and income for our local fishers. We see more juveniles in these areas that are protected, and that also translates to local employment, including new entry to the fishing sector. And, from a science point of view and even education, then there's that improved understanding on the biology of the different species that are done, because then research institutes are actively involved in assessing these areas. Another one, when you come to the OECM, there is that role or benefit in increasing income for small-scale fishers, but also this idea of using some of the eco-tools to now bring together ecotourism and diving tourism. It's got that potential benefit of making these even more beneficial areas than they are. So yes, overall, in terms of the fisheries and aquaculture sectors, we found that these special protection measures we've assessed here, not only do they kind of help protect biodiversity, but also when you design FSRS, MPAs, and OCM, it's an economic imperative because they have those benefits which, as I've explained earlier. And therefore, it's to us, the study justifies the need for more areas to be strictly protected, especially in line with EU's biodiversity strategy. A couple of key recommendations that we're making here is, and especially the two case studies of the one in France and one in Spain, we struggled with the data. In some places, you found that, yes, there is a vessel monitoring system for the vessels that fish inside that area, but where they land their catch is not related to where they've caught it. So although you can trace the vessel movement, the catch and the kind of tracks of the vessel are all handled by different organizations. And it was very difficult then to relate the total catch to that vessel and to exactly where that catches come from. And those are the sort of studies then, or data we need to be able to separate between that impact of that cause on, kind of what's happening in there. And that then, what we're recommending here is to have that data more available, and especially when it's being collected and stored, if scientists, for example, could be involved right at the start to design a data collection framework that helps when it comes to analysis. Another one is the robustness of the cost-benefit analysis. That's still needed, and especially, as I've alluded to, is related to disaggregated data. And that needs to focus more on, okay, fine, this area has been closed, but usually it doesn't stay there. The restrictions and the management practices tend to, kind of be enhanced. So yes, you've got a fishing box, for example, but then you've also said, okay, don't catch buried females. You can only use this type of hook. You can only do. How do we then separate those different, management practices that come later on with just the effect of the closed area? Again, that is a question that, further work needs to do, especially with more disaggregated data. Another one is funding. There's need for more funding to support initiatives that the society, the communities are doing, especially in realizing the benefits of these special protection measures, but also surveillance and enforcement, just to make sure that, it was established, for example, in 2007, but because of the back and forth, enforcement started in 2009, and we just need to get that enforcement going, because it's through that enforcement that we can now start saying there is benefits. In most of the case studies here, at least the two, we found that the benefits started really being realized after 10 years of protection. So that's something that, once the enforcement is rigorous, that could help those benefits to be realized. And then, there's need for funding towards monitoring programs, as I've just said. So yeah, so we need to improve mainly that side of assessment with that stakeholder knowledge. And this is where I think setting up these protected areas with a bottom-up approach really helps when it comes to this endeavor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor for a couple of minutes to Mr. Wakeford.
Okay, thank you very much. So as you saw, that we've had a summary there of the presentation that we've done on the cost and benefits of those case studies. As I say, this really is now an opportunity for you to ask us a series of questions. You might have those about the case studies themselves, or something a bit more specific about MPAs in the broader context. So I don't have anything specific to add to the presentation, so I welcome now you to ask us a series of particular questions on either the presentation or something that's much broader. Thank you.
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wakeford. Since the presentation has now been concluded, now we're going to have a round of questions from the members. If anyone has any analysis or questions, clarifications. Let's start by Ms. Carbais.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for this study that we just heard, because there's a lot of benefits to understanding the benefits to the ecosystem, but also the socio-economic costs and benefits of marine spatial planning and marine protected areas. These are instruments which can bring together the richness of the blue economy and marine nature. So we need to keep this in mind when we are thinking about what a marine protected area is. But this also means we need to be clear, consistent, criteria and definitions need to be harmonized. There needs to be a lot of transparency and a lot of dialogue between the fishers, other stakeholders, the scientific community and decision makers, an ongoing dialogue. Yesterday we spoke here about the importance of co-management tools, and without dialogue it would be very hard to understand how important marine protected areas are. Since 1980, Portugal has had marine protected areas in the Azores, the seas around the Azores. There are over 16,000 square kilometers of ocean. That's a lot of ocean. And we need human resources to monitor these areas. And once again, I'll bring up the importance of dialogue. We need to have the fishers on our side. They have been vital for the collection of data. They don't want their ocean to become dead. But this has been ongoing work for decades now for them to understand the importance of data collection, transmitting reliable data. But we're speaking here about over 160,000 square kilometers of ocean. We spoke about marine protected areas, which are only financed with public funds, and this is a great challenge. But I think it's a challenge which is worth taking on. The Sea of the Azores has been a great example to show that fisher communities can understand the benefits. And I'll just end on this note. We often talk about marine protected areas, and it's important to understand that this is a living concept. A marine protected area on paper is a contradiction in terms. It exists in reality, and this reality needs to be dynamic. This implies control, vigilance, adaptation, and what today may be a marine protected area, in the future, even if it's a long way away, it may need to be protected further, for example. So these are living concepts, and we need to keep up with them. And we can only keep up with them by controlling them carefully. And this, again, can only be achieved through co-management with the presence of all the involved stakeholders in this permanent dialogue. And as we heard, we need more data. The socioeconomic impact is something we need to work on further. We need more disaggregated data. We need further monitoring. And to conclude, we need more communication, because we need to be able to communicate with the rest of the community, the rest of society, the rest of the European Union, member states who don't need to manage marine protected areas. We need to be able to tell them how important the impacts are, what's going well, what isn't, the costs, and compensation which needs to exist in an initial phase of marine protected areas, the implementation of these areas, for example. So consistency, harmonization of criteria, these are fundamental, and marine protected areas are very important. They are an essential part of the future of the marine economy and of humanity, because our existence is deeply tied with the ocean. So once again, thank you very much for this study. Thank you, Chair.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carvais.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup pour cette.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this very interesting study. We know that marine protected areas and other marine spatial planning methods are often seen badly by the fisheries sector. we know that there are important economic benefits to these areas for the fisheries sector and environmental benefits as well. In the presentation you made this morning, you said that marine protected areas have led to stabilization of catches. There are more juveniles, there are more benefits for local fisher communities, more jobs in the sector, and this is all very good. If we want to cover 30% of European waters with marine protected areas. I have a few questions. People often denounce marine protected areas on paper, as my colleague said, without any real protection methods. You spoke about there being more benefits than costs and so on. Do you think a true marine protected area brings more economic benefits than a marine protected area which is solely on paper? You also speak about the importance of involving stakeholders, especially in the marine sector, the fisheries sector, in the management of marine protected areas. And this is actually something I suggested in my report on More Fish in the Sea. In this morning's presentation, you gave two examples of marine protected areas in Brittany in France and in Galicia in Spain. Do you think these are successful implementations where the fisheries sector is concerned? And how can we overcome the fact that small fishers don't often have the time to spend on these processes, where big companies, for example, will have these resources? Thank you.
Roos.
Thank you, Madam Roos. Harrison.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for this study and for the presentation. The most important lesson I've gleaned here is that the protection of areas can be a success if we take it head on, and that the involvement of fishers is crucial. Then it can be successful. That's my main takeaway. The way we are now acting in the EU is not bottom up, it's top down, unfortunately. The biodiversity strategy with the goal of 30% has been set from the top down. And this is very complicated, because even in my own contact with fishers, I've seen that they believe that this goal has been set from the top, and that isn't a recipe for success. We also need to bear in mind diversity in Europe. Some areas may have the space and the need for the implementation of marine protected areas, maybe up to 30%, and in other areas this need doesn't exist. So we need to decide whether these areas are actually needed in some places. There's this need to keep an eye on diversity, and that needs to be a guiding principle. I have a few concrete questions. If we're talking about spatial planning and spreading marine protected areas, and especially how that intersects with wind power, some areas in the sea have very little room left for fishers to actually fish. And I think that leads us to some interesting management possibilities. What do researchers think about this combination of wind power in marine protected areas? Do you see any possibility of combining these two things in interesting ways? I also noticed that when we are looking at the cost-benefit analysis, well, I didn't notice I noticed that when you're talking about an area, fishers can't go to these marine protected areas anymore. So there's lost income here. How do you account for that? How do you account for the lost income of the fishers when these areas are implemented? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Madam Mato.
Grazie Presidente, io ringrazio
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here today, and this study is extremely important. It helps us to understand how best to manage these areas, and co-management as well, of course. One thing is certain is that we need to protect our marine biodiversity, and it's very urgent, in fact. The benefits of the spatial protection measures need, I think, more research, and they also need more funding, actually, in order to be able to implement practices better. And so I'm asking the Commission, I mean, we know that there is funding there. We need to ensure that that is used for research. And we also need more funding to ensure that the benefits become more widespread, the benefits of these protection measures. And I want to ask the Commission whether there are countries that haven't adopted the spatial protection plans, because it's very important to realise that. My country, for example, has incurred a delay of about a year and a half in terms of presenting this spatial plan. And Italy is the centre of the Mediterranean, you could say. So that's quite serious, actually. And are there other countries that haven't presented these plans yet? And I think there are. And that's why we need to stop that from happening. We need to ensure that not more delay is incurred. The benefits often come in at a later stage, further down the line, even a decade later. It's important to remember that as well. It's not going to be immediate, the effect. And it's important to ensure that there are costs, realise that there are costs when, for example, it's completely impossible to fish in certain zones. So how do you bridge that divide? Can you invest in fishing tourism, for example, instead? Is there a way of ensuring that this gap is filled for people that then can't fish and lose their income? There's this idea of sustainable fisheries tourism. That's important. Would it be possible to have that developed to such an extent that it plugs the gap of lost income? So what I'm saying is that these areas are really important. It's important to know that there is diversification. And that needs to be taken advantage of for fishers that then can't do their normal activities. They need to know about it.
Thank you very much, Madam Keller.
Thank you, and thanks also for me for the study and for the presentation. I found that very interesting. Also, your very clear conclusion that indeed there is a benefit very much on the plus side, also for the fishers, and I guess for society overall as well. And I found that interesting that on the aquaculture, there you mentioned this diversification of income, like the ecological tourism, which I found, well, very interesting, like, because I wouldn't think in aquaculture as a thing that would attract tourists. You know, if I want to go diving, I want to see, you know, nature as it is, and I don't know, different fishes and whatever, but not necessarily a fish farm. Like, if I want to go into nature, I don't go into a chicken factory either, because, you know, that's why I'm wondering, how did you get there? Like, what do you see there is a benefit for ecological tourism? Just to understand, because I found that very interesting. I hadn't heard about that before. And then very specifically also, you mentioned fish recruiting device that could be put around these cage farms. Could you specify what exactly that is? And if we're trying to get fish into that zone around the cage farms, if I understood that correctly, that this is the purpose of those fish recruiting devices, isn't that also a problem? Because we have seen incidences of specific diseases in those cage farms and aquaculture, and that might then also spread. I mean, in any case, it might spread, but if we're trying to get fish closer to there, isn't that also a danger for them? And then what I also found interesting is that you've mentioned that the private profits for the fishers have gone up in the cases and the case studies that you've had. So they are generating more income from that as soon as there is enforcement, and there has been some time for the fish stock to recover. So in the end, it's the public that makes an investment, like it was the municipalities, it was the state who are putting an investment in, and out of that we get a private profit. And that I find very interesting, because indeed we're always discussing compensation also for the fishers, but after all, it's the public, like all the taxpayers, investing into something so that individuals get a profit out of that. And I guess that wasn't part of your study, but I find that interesting. Also, what do we learn out of that? Like, do we at any point then also ask the fishers, hey guys, you've made a profit from that. Maybe you need to reinvest something as well, either in the public sphere or in that specific biodiversity hotspot, which is specifically created. I mean, yeah, sure, also for biodiversity, but also in order to help the income of fishers. So that's just, you don't really need to answer to that, because I wasn't necessarily part of that. But I do find it interesting that we get quite a lot of private profit out of a public investment. So thank you once again.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Since we have a representative of the Commission, Madam Tanking, and since there was a specific question asked here, I'm going to just hand the floor to her right now.
Good morning, and thank you for the very interesting study and the questions. Maybe just to say what we see from this study, and it links to the question posed. Indeed, it's very important to work bottom-up, and there is a crucial role here also for member states. So there was the question on the MSP, so the spatial plans of member states. So in the report that the Commission did, at that stage there were 14 out of the member states that have them fully established, the spatial plan. So indeed there is still progress. That was a couple of months back, so I would have to check with the colleagues where we are for the moment. The Commission is, of course, following up with those member states. In terms of the stakeholder bottom-up and the funding, just to say that indeed we work very hard now with the member states to be sure that they adopt their programs under the MFAF, so the European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund. And there is a big scope there to fund projects linked to MPAs. Also, maybe just interesting to highlight for the Parliament is the role of the fisheries local action groups. So under the fund there is the specific focus on fisheries local action groups who can work on community-led local coastal development. And there we also see quite a number of interesting projects linked to MPAs and linked to sustainable fisheries management and better coherence between the environment and the fisheries implementation. And so there again, it's for member states to provide funding under the MFAF. Also, it is for the member states, of course, to see how to implement the targets. I listened to the comment of Mr. Ruijsen. Of course, there are the general objectives, but ultimately it's really for the member states to see how best to adopt the areas, where to put them. And then under the common fisheries policy, we have the full toolbox available on the regionalization for them to adopt different types of measures. And the study gives us a really interesting insight of what kind of measures work best. And of course, each area is different, each case is different, but thank you.
Thank you, Madam Tankin. And now, briefly, I'm just going to speak on my own behalf. Since I'm here, and since I'm chairing, I have to make sure I'm doing my job correctly, and I'll just allow myself to ask you two questions at this point. I think there is a common mistake that's made, or perhaps it's an inaccuracy. These MPAs are aimed to be established across 30% of European waters. and this was also mentioned by another institution for ocean governance, but I want to just put this idea on the table, because here it talks about other effective area-based conservation measures. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a marine protected area. This 30% we've talked about, it can also be another type of protected area, like the OECM. And then also, we've talked about other areas where fishing is not allowed, no-take areas, for example. And I'd also like to mention the following. I think that we've got these case studies about aquaculture and fisheries, and what I understand from the study, I don't think you can say with certainty that marine protected areas are necessarily really beneficial for fishing. And I think you said that it wasn't easy to establish what the cost and benefits are, and that could be problematic. And in some studies carried out by the Commission itself, it's not specifically demonstrated that there is an economic benefit for fishers. So the marine protected areas, it says, do offer great socio-economic benefits, but also part of that's to do with tourism, not necessarily for the fishing sector. So from an economic point of view, I think there are some discrepancies here when we really look at what the benefits are. And of course there can be these conflicts between people who are, losing income, for example, and others. I think some of this isn't quite clear. I've always said that marine protected areas are not necessarily going to solve everything. They are perhaps necessary to promote diversity, but they're not a silver bullet, and they're not the only tool we can use. In any case, they need to, of course, not be seen as imposed externally, and also they need to be established in collaboration with fishers. And now I'm going to open the floor to whoever would like to answer those various questions that have been asked so far. Who would like to speak? Mr. Mangi.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the reactions and comments and the questions as well. We'll go through the questions, but it's good to know that this is quite an interesting subject. I mean, it really interests us as researchers to do these sort of studies. If I start with the benefits to the fisheries sector, what you find is once the area has been protected and enforced, the initial benefits, say income of fishing, the fishing sector goes down, but after a while that then starts to rise. Okay, so there'll be that initial almost kind of shock of having to move somewhere else where, sometimes we've got a lot of displacement and congestion in areas, but that is a kind of short term, and then over time that goes up. And this is what we're saying here. Most studies show around 10 years of effective enforcement, you find that the fisheries sector starts to benefit. Obviously, in places where you've got a lot of tourism, then if you add the benefits to tourism and fisheries sector and the costs, you find the side of benefits will be quite high. But you can still remove the benefits to tourism, just consider the fisheries. And obviously it depends on the case, but at least there are so many cases where fisheries have quite high benefits due to areas being closed. And again, as we're saying, it depends on the sort of closure. If you have quite a mixed multiple use areas, it becomes difficult to completely separate what's a benefit due to the fisheries sector as opposed to other sectors. But that's I think it's been quite established. When it comes to the bottom-up approach, especially, what you need really is both a bottom-up and a top-down. So bottom-up in terms of the buy-in and in terms of the local sectors, including the fishermen being involved. But you also need the top-down for the legislation to ensure that whoever breaks the laws there, they can be, prosecuted or that. So you need that bit of enforcement, that bit of, authority coming from the top, while the bottom-up then approach is really getting, the stakeholders to, get that buy-in and feel that area belongs to them, and instead of them seeing that it's been imposed. So there are different ways of doing that. Clearly, if it can start from the bottom up and then have the top kind of down, the kind of management more enforceable, and then meet somewhere in between there, the success is much higher. The other points then on looking at wind energy and collocating, say, MPAs in wind energy. There's a study we did, and I'm happy to share some of that. But the finding is, yes, it's doable, and it really helps, especially when it comes to the marine planning. I mean, it's already happening now. You have some offshore wind farms where fishing activities are not allowed. So those could be. The key thing to note here is, if we're thinking of MPA, we're looking more protecting biodiversity. And I'm not sure whether the offshore wind farms are set in areas that have the high biodiversity. So we need almost to kind of situate the wind farms in areas where the biodiversity is protected, because if it's just a sandy area, then what are you protecting? You know what I mean? But at least having those wind farms in areas where that biodiversity is and having minimal disturbance, and then over time you can have that marine protected area effect. So a lot of it will come down to marine spatial planning and how you situate to both get the benefits due to biodiversity increase, but also have the wind farm generation. Okay, then I move to the aquaculture side and the recruitment devices. So there's there's two studies that have been done, and our colleague based in Greece ran this one, where they used they just call them eco tools, but I guess it's artificial wind farm. And where you have the licensed area, you put these the fish recruiting devices slightly outside of that area, and because you've got the 200 non-trawling zone outside, this is the area that almost becomes a park. So the catch farm here is going on with their business of whatever sea bream or the different species that they're culturing there, and this is the area where the fish starts to get attracted, and there's times that you get dolphins and that. So the tourism was really meant to have it come and view what was already been almost attracted into this area. And because you have that 200 meters, then the thing is, as you say, maybe diseases, maybe a lot of affluence, so it's a balancing act and how you go about that. But in terms of the setup, that is something that is doable. And it's there are people who, because the whole project was to almost improve the attitudes towards aquaculture. So these people who are really strongly against aquaculture and kind of what it does to the environment, all of a sudden could get these snorkeling tours around it, and they're like, oh, okay, it's not that bad then, something like that. So, like I say, it's not been rolled out widely, but it's a concept that when we come to looking at the 30%, strategy, making a third of the waters to be all under our protection, that's something that could then be put in that mix. What's the other question? Yeah, public investment versus personal investments. Again, I think that so if you most of the costs, as we were saying, were covered by public funds, and I see that to be a good way of getting the protected areas off the ground, because otherwise, if the community has to come up with kind of the money to implement some of this, that might not happen. But if the communities then are engaged at the start, I said, with the bottom up kind of top down approach, they start kind of saying, okay, we're happy to have those initial losses in this area because of the future gain. And therefore, while looking more like, public investing, and then you have the personal benefits, that also meets that kind of biodiversity target, and therefore it's a good thing. So I don't see that to be quite a challenge if it's all set in the boundaries of we will kind of at that implementation process or that establishment process, we'll put money, we'll pay the scientists to do this. But then once it starts, you guys now have the role of compliance and enforcement, because then you can see the benefits you're getting from this. The moment that they've been involved in the setup, the enforcement costs are going to go low because they will respect and kind of like that area. And therefore, you have a big blob of public funding, a lot of it at the start, over time that goes down and the personal benefits go up. If these areas have been imposed on them, then they will be the ones to keep, kind of working around the system to come and do all poaching and everything, and that clearly will have even higher costs. So again, to me, it comes down to how we set these up, and how we involve the different parties and have that frank discussion. I don't think we can get to a point where we've discussed and agreed everything. So somewhere, this is where the top-down sort of works. You need somebody to say this is going ahead, and then others kind of start moving around that. But at least initial discussion, getting everybody on board, and then seeing how far we go. I think I have answered all of them, but happy to see whether my colleagues have anything to add to that.
Thank you. Any other? Nada más. Sí, adelante.
Over to you.
Thank you. I think Mangi just hit a very important point there, that you certainly can reduce the enforcement costs if you have buy-in from the local stakeholders and they can start to see the benefits. Obviously, there will be initial costs before those benefits start to come in, and I think that's the timing is very, very important in all of this, and to try and understand sort of what the time scales are. There's also, when you have people on the water, as it is, within these areas, they can all help to benefit, sort of help protect those areas, see what's going on, whether they're actually fishermen or whether they're part of tourism, and so they're all active on the water, able to see sort of what other impacts are going on in the area. So, in certain MPAs that have fishing activities, maybe low impacts from pots or creels or so, rather than trawling, they can actually provide also an unseen benefit to some of the protections of the area. So, fishing isn't necessarily seen as a sort of a negative in that front. They can provide some positives. The other comment that I wanted to make as well with regards to sort of tourism in some of these farms, we know also in sort of the bluefin fishery in the Mediterranean, there's some diving that's going on inside the cages, because there's a wonderful opportunity to see these large sort of marine fauna, and I think there's unseen or untapped opportunities that perhaps we haven't necessarily explored at this point. So there's lots, I think, to be able to consider. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Would anyone like a clarification? No one? Okay, at this point I'd like to thank our guests for coming. It's been a delight to have you here with us today. Thank you for sharing this document with us.
Vale.
Okay, it looks like we're not going to look at item 12 today, so we're already at item 13. Any other business? Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to bring anything up? No issues? Okay, next meetings. On the 30th of November, we'll have the next meeting. And on the 1st of December, in the morning. And remember that we'll be happy to see the Commissioner at the next meeting as well. Thank you very much to the technical team. Thank you very much to the interpreters and the Secretariat. See you next time. And I'm not quite sure when the next time I'll chair will be, but thank you very much in any case.